For the last 20 years of her life, one of the wealthiest women in America lived in a small, plain hospital room in New York, not because she was sick. Doctors repeatedly confirmed she was healthy enough to leave. She simply refused to go home. And she had 3 of the most magnificent empty mansions in the country waiting for her. She owned a 42-room apartment on 5th Avenue, untouched and immaculate. A clifftop estate in Santa Barbara, staffed and spotless, that she had not seen in nearly 60 years. A 52-room chateau in Connecticut she never spent a single night in. All of them kept perfect. All of them empty. While she lay in a hospital bed by choice. Why would a woman worth more than $300 million abandon every palace she owned to hide, voluntarily, in a hospital room for 20 years? This is the story of the Clark dynasty. Her father clawed his way out of poverty to become one of the richest men in America. A copper king who proved money could purchase absolutely anything, including a seat in the United States Senate. And he passed that fortune to a daughter named Huguette, who used it to do the one thing he never dreamed of, to vanish from the world entirely. A father so corrupt that Mark Twain called him a disgrace to the nation. A beloved sister, dead at 16, who took a piece of Huguette into the grave with her. And a fortune that, in the end, drew a circle of people round a frail old woman, a nurse, a hospital, a lawyer, each of them with a reason to keep her right where she was. Watch this not as the story of an eccentric recluse. Watch it as the question hiding inside every great fortune. What if the money doesn't free you at all? What if it slowly walls you in? And remember one small object, a porcelain doll, dressed and perfect, sitting in a quiet room. We will come back to what it was really doing there. Begin with a poor young man walking into the mountains of Montana with a pick, a mule, and an appetite for wealth that nothing would ever satisfy. He was born in 1839 in a log house in Pennsylvania, the son of struggling farmers. And he grew up with very little and wanted, fiercely, to be somebody. He taught school, he drove a wagon, and when gold and silver fever swept the American West, William Andrews Clark went west with it, not to dig at first, but to do something smarter. He sold goods to the miners. He banked their money. He lent it back to them at hard rates. And slowly, coldly, methodically, he turned other men's desperation into capital. His name was William Andrews Clark. And the engine that drove him was a single relentless conviction. That money was the measure of a man, and that with enough of it, there was nothing on earth he could not have. Then came the metal that made him a titan. Not gold, copper. As America wired itself for electricity, every lamp, every telegraph, every motor demanding copper wire, Clark bought the mines of Butte, Montana, the richest hill on earth. The poor Pennsylvania farm boy became a copper king, one of a handful of men who controlled the metal that the entire modern world now ran on. And here is the belief that became the secret engine of the whole dynasty. Clark concluded, from his own astonishing rise, that everything had a price, and that he could afford any of them. Respect, power, beauty, position. To William Andrews Clark, there was no such thing as something money couldn't buy. There was only a price not yet met. It was the lesson his life had taught him, and he would live by it without shame, all the way to its most notorious conclusion. We will return to exactly how far he was willing to take it. For now, hold the image. A cold, brilliant, self-made man who looked at the world and saw, in everything and everyone, a transaction waiting to happen. He was about to buy his way to the very top of American life. And in doing so, he would build the cage his daughter would one day disappear inside. The rise of William Andrews Clark was total, and the way he climbed tells you everything about the family to come. By the turn of the century, Clark's copper fortune had made him one of the 2 or 3 richest men in America, his wealth rivaling the Rockefellers and the Astors. He owned mines, banks, railroads, newspapers, and a city he more or less built as a railway waypoint, a desert town called Las Vegas. The money simply would not stop multiplying, but money alone was never enough for him. Clark wanted what money was supposedly not able to buy: prestige, legitimacy, a place among the rulers of the nation. He wanted to be a United States senator, and rather than win it, he decided, true to his life's one belief, to simply purchase it. In 1899, Clark secured a U.S. Senate seat from Montana, through what became one of the most infamous bribery scandals in American history: cash, by multiple accounts, handed to state legislators in envelopes in exchange for their votes. The scandal was so flagrant that the U.S. Senate refused to seat him, and he was forced to give it up. The corruption was so notorious that it became a rallying example for reformers. Part of the very push that led to the 17th Amendment, which took the election of senators away from bribable legislatures and gave it directly to the people. Mark Twain himself delivered the verdict that follows Clark to this day. He wrote that Clark was as rotten a human being as can be found anywhere under the flag, and that he is to me the most disgusting creature that the Republic has produced since Tweed's time. The richest man in Montana had bought everything money could reach, and earned the open contempt of the greatest writer in America. And notice what Clark did next, because it is the purest expression of the man. Disgraced over the bribery, he maneuvered and won the seat again, legitimately enough to serve a full term. He did not feel shame. He felt only that a transaction had been temporarily blocked and then completed. To Clark, the lesson held, everything has a price. He served his term. He returned to New York, and to crown the fortune, he set out to build the most expensive private house the city had ever seen, a monument to a poor boy who had bought his way to the summit of the world. Stand on Fifth Avenue in 1911 and look up at the house William Andrews Clark built, and the sheer scale of it is almost comic. It had 121 rooms, 4 art galleries, a private rail line tunneled underground to deliver coal to its furnaces, towers and a rotunda, bronze and marble imported from Europe by the shipload. It cost a fortune so vast that New Yorkers, half in awe and half in mockery, nicknamed it Clark's Folly. It was by many accounts the largest and most expensive private residence in the city. A Copper King's answer to every person who had ever looked down on the Pennsylvania. Picture the world inside it. Price placings, Clark's beloved collection of altas, lace and tapestries, an organ, rooms upon rooms of European splendor assembled by a man determined to prove that he belonged among emperors. And into this colossal house, in his late 60s, Clark brought a young second wife, Anna, decades his junior, once his ward, and 2 small daughters, Andre and the baby, Huguette. This was the absolute zenith of the Clark dynasty. The corrupt, brilliant founder, the immense fortune, the palace on Fifth Avenue, the 2 beautiful little girls who would inherit it all. It looked like the perfect Gilded Age fairy tale, and it was, in fact, the most gilded cage ever built in America. And one of those little girls would spend the rest of her life trying to escape it. Look closely at the 2 little girls inside the 121-room palace, and the first crack is already visible. Huguette and her sister Andre grew up in extraordinary isolation. Children of an elderly, formidable father old enough to be their grandfather, and a quiet, protective mother, raised inside a fortress of marble, where almost no one their own age ever came. They were rich beyond imagining and profoundly sheltered, their entire world reduced to family, servants' art, and each other. And here is the detail that contains the whole tragedy to come. In that vast, echoing house, Huguette's entire emotional world narrowed down to one person, her older sister, Andre. Andre was her companion, her protector, her best and nearly only friend. The fortune had given the girls everything except a normal life, full of other people. So they became each other's world, which meant that Huguette had placed her entire heart in a single irreplaceable person. The Clark money had isolated her so completely that she had only one true human connection in all the world. And in 1919, that one connection would die. William Andrews Clark had built it all. The Copper Empire, the bought Senate seat, the 121-room palace. He had spent a lifetime proving that money could purchase anything a man could want. But in 1919, in that perfect house, the family was about to meet the one merchant who does not take bribes, who cannot be bought, who answers to no fortune on earth. Death came for the Clark family, and it came not for the old, corrupt founder, but for the one person his youngest daughter loved more than anyone in the world. And after that, Huguette Clark would never be the same. For a brief window, the Clark daughters seemed to have the most charmed lives imaginable. They divided their time between the Fifth Avenue Palace, a country estate, and long sojourns in France, where the family kept deep roots. Huguette and Andre spoke French, were tutored privately, painted, played music, and moved through a small, gilded world of culture and beauty. Their father, for all his coldness in business, doted on his 2 girls. Their mother, Anna, was gentle so devoted. To the outside world, they were storybook heiresses, and this is precisely where the story lulls you. The French tutors, the paintings, the devoted parents. You look at these two sheltered, artistic girls inside their palace and you think, surely a childhood this protected, this cushioned by money, must be a safe one. Surely nothing can reach them in there. But look again at the nature of that protection. The Clark fortune hadn't just sheltered the girls. It had sealed them off. They had almost no friends outside the family. Their entire social and emotional life was the household, their parents, their servants, and above all, each other. The wealth that looked like a cushion was, in truth, a wall, and behind it, the sisters had no one but themselves. A poor child in a crowded tenement has a dozen people to lean on when grief comes. The richest girls in America had been sealed away from almost everyone, so that when grief finally came, there would be no crowd to catch them. There would be only the two of them. And then there would be one. In 1919, Andrée Clark, Huguette's adored older sister, her companion and protector, her whole inner world, fell ill with meningitis. There was no cure. The Clark fortune, which could buy a Senate seat and a 121-room palace and the old masters of Europe, could do nothing at all. In August of 1919, a week before her 17th birthday, Andrée died. Huguette was 12 years old. Picture the youngest Clark daughter in that moment. 12 years old, in a vast and now half-empty house, having just lost the single person who had been her entire human world. Not one friend among many. The friend, the only one, the sister she had been sealed away with since birth. The center of gravity of her whole small life simply vanished. And here is the wound that explains everything that follows. Every empty mansion, every locked door, the hospital room at the end of it all. When Andrée died, the lesson Huguette absorbed was the most dangerous one a sheltered, grieving child can learn. That love means unbearable loss. That the people you let into your heart are taken from you. That the safest thing, the only safe thing, is not to need anyone that much ever again. By every later account, those who knew her said the death of her sister left a permanent hole in Huguette, and that she withdrew into herself in ways she never fully came out of. The vibrant, sheltered little girl began, quietly, to learn how to disappear, understand what the Clark fortune had just done. It had isolated the sisters so completely that Andrée was nearly all Huguette had, and then it stood by, useless, as that one connection died. The money created the overdependence, and the money could not prevent the loss. It set the trap, and then sprang it, and the grief did not strike Huguette alone. It struck her mother, Anna, with equal force. And out of that grief came an act that quietly tells you how this family would forever try to cope with loss. Anna did not seek comfort in other people. She built a monument. In her daughter's memory, she funded a bird sanctuary in Santa Barbara, the Andrée Clark Bird Refuge, which carries the dead girl's name to this day. It was a beautiful gesture. It was also, quietly, the family's whole philosophy of grief in miniature. When you lose a person, you do not turn to other people. You turn the loss into something you can build and own and control, something that cannot die on you again. Huguette was learning that lesson too, and she would spend the next 90 years living by it. The family had lost a daughter, and 6 years later, it would lose its founder. The true first casualty of the Clark fortune was Andrée, and to understand Huguette, we have to weigh exactly what her sister's death set in motion. Andrée Clark was the dynasty's lost child, the bright-loved elder daughter who should have been the second-generation heiress beside her sister, and who instead died at 16, leaving Huguette as the sole surviving child of the marriage. She is the missing Clark, the one the bird refuge is named for, the absence around which her sister's entire long life would silently organize itself. And then, in 1925, the second blow landed. William Andrews Clark died at 86. Huguette was 18. In the space of 6 years, she had lost her sister and her father, the two pillars of her sealed little world, and inherited, along with her mother, an immense share of one of the great American fortunes. She was now one of the richest young women in the country. She was also, in every way that matters, alone. Her sister was dead. Her father was dead. She had been raised behind a wall of money with almost no one her own age. And she had learned, at 12, that loving someone deeply was simply an invitation to be destroyed when they were taken. This is the true inheritance. Not the copper millions, but the lesson underneath them. The founder believed money could buy anything and protect against anything. His daughter inherited that belief in the cruelest inverted form. She had unlimited money, and it had protected her against nothing. Not her sister's death, not her father's, not the loneliness of the great empty house. So she drew the only conclusion her experience offered. If money couldn't keep people safe, then she would use it for the opposite purpose. She would use it to keep people out, to build a life so sealed, so controlled, so solitary, that nothing could ever be taken from her again, because she would never again let herself have anything to lose. What is the use of inheriting one of the greatest fortunes in America, if the first thing it teaches you is that the people you love will die anyway, and all your money can do is buy you a quieter room to grieve in? The first tragedy. Not Huguette's own end, but the death of the sister that hollowed her out at 12 and set the entire trajectory of her 100-year life. From this point on, Huguette Clark would move through the world like someone slowly, deliberately closing doors. But before she sealed the last one, she would try exactly once, to do what young heiresses were supposed to do. She would try to marry. In 1928, Huguette Clark did the expected thing. She married. The groom was William MacDonald Gower, the son of one of her late father's business associates, a suitable match between appropriate families. For a brief moment, the heiress stepped into the role the world had written for her. Society wedding, eligible husband, the promise of a normal dynastic life. It lasted barely 2 years. They married in 1928 and divorced in 1930. By multiple later accounts, the marriage was deeply unhappy and was reportedly never even consummated, a union that existed on paper and at parties but never became a true intimacy. Huguette, it seems, could not let even her own husband all the way in. Whatever the precise truth behind the closed doors, and the sources here are careful, the marriage simply failed to take root, and Huguette walked away from it and never married again. See the pattern that André's death set, hardening into the shape of an adult life. Offered the most ordinary human intimacy, a marriage, Huguette could not, or would not, open the door. The wall the fortune had built and grief had reinforced was now simply who she was. At 24, she quietly closed the one relationship that might have pulled her back into the ordinary world of other people. And then she turned, instead, to a world she could entirely control. After the divorce, Huguette Clark withdrew, not all at once, but steadily, decade by decade, into a private universe of her own making, a universe of paintings she made and showed no one, of palatial homes she kept perfect and refused to live in, and of dolls, thousands of them, on which she would lavish a fortune, and a tenderness she could no longer risk on a single living person. The richest recluse in America was being born, and her strangest decades were still ahead of her. After her divorce in 1930, Huguette Clark did not collapse, and she did not rebel. She did something quieter, and in its way, far stranger. She began, slowly and deliberately, to withdraw from the human world, and to replace it, piece by piece, with things she could perfectly control. She had the means to do it on a scale no one else on earth could match. Consider the kingdom she retreated into. The 42-room apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue, actually multiple apartments, she combined overlooking Central Park. Kept staffed, immaculate, and increasingly empty. Bellosguardo, the family's clifftop estate in Santa Barbara, with its own staff, its ocean views, its rooms full of fine furniture, maintained in flawless condition for decades, though Huguette stopped visiting it around the 1950s and would never see it again. And later, Le Beau Chateau, a 52-room mansion in Connecticut that she purchased and renovated and kept in perfect order, and in which, by every account, she never spent a single night. Sit with that for one moment, because it is the entire mystery in a single image. A woman pouring millions of dollars, year after year, into the upkeep of 3 palatial homes, paying armies of staff to dust, polish, garden, and guardrooms that no one ever entered. Empty mansions, kept eternally ready for a life that was never lived in them. She wasn't maintaining houses. She was maintaining the idea of a life, a perfect, frozen, untouchable life that could never disappoint her or be taken from her, precisely because she never actually lived it. And in the place of the people she would not let in, she gathered things she could love safely. She became a painter, genuinely skilled, trained in the French tradition, producing canvases she rarely showed to anyone. She became an obsessive expert collector of dolls, antique French and Japanese dolls, and exquisite custom-made dollhouses and miniatures, commissioned to extraordinary specifications and costing, over the years, many millions of dollars. She studied them, dressed them, corresponded at length about their tiniest details. She lavished on these silent, perfect, unchanging figures, the care, the attention, and the tenderness she could no longer risk on a living person. And here is the dark logic underneath it all, the thing that makes Huguette so unlike every other heiress. A doll cannot die on you. A painting cannot leave you. An empty, perfect room cannot break your heart. Huguette had learned at 12, when André died, that loving living things meant unbearable loss. So she rebuilt her entire emotional life around things that could not be lost. The fortune that her father believed could buy anything. His daughter used to buy the one thing he never imagined. A world with all the danger of human love surgically removed. By the 1980s, Huguette Clark was an elderly woman living almost entirely alone in her Fifth Avenue apartment, wealthy beyond measure, surrounded by priceless art and beloved dolls, visited by almost no one. She spoke to a handful of relatives and advisors, mostly by telephone. She had, with great patience and great expense, built herself a life from which nearly every other human being had been removed. The world outside imagined the Clark heiress, if it thought of her at all, living in jet-set luxury. The reality was an old woman in a sealed apartment, talking to doll-makers and watching cartoons, who had not been seen in public in years. The greatest copper fortune in America had purchased its heiress the most complete solitude money could build. She had succeeded, completely, in walling out the world. She had built the perfect prison and locked it from the inside. And then, in 1991, a health scare gave her the final wall she had been looking for her whole life. And she stepped behind it and never came out. But a person who removes the whole world from her life does not end up with no one. She ends up with a very small number of people, and enormous power concentrated in their hands. Understand the situation that Huguette's withdrawal had quietly created. Here was a woman worth hundreds of millions of dollars, with no spouse, no children, no close friends, and only distant relatives she barely knew or had never met. Almost everyone who could have loved her for herself was either dead or had been shut out decades ago, which meant that the handful of people who did have daily access to her, the ones who answered her phone calls, managed her money, and tended to her body, held the keys to one of the last great unguarded fortunes in America. Two men managed her affairs, an attorney and an accountant, who together controlled the flow of her money. And as the years passed, one person above all others became the center of Huguette's shrunken world. Her name was Hadassah Perry, a private duty nurse who began caring for Huguette in 1991 and would remain at her side day after day for the next 20 years. By all accounts, Perry was genuinely devoted, attentive, present. She gave Huguette the steady daily companionship the old woman had denied herself for half a century. For the lonely heiress, this nurse became something like family. The closest, most constant human relationship Huguette had allowed herself since her sister died in 1919. And here the loop opens that will define the final reckoning. The one person Huguette finally let close, at the very end of her life, was a paid employee. There is real tenderness in that, and real danger. Because when a fortune of this size flows toward the few people in the room, intentions become impossible to read cleanly. Was the devotion real? Almost certainly, in part. Was it also richly, almost unimaginably rewarded? We will see exactly how much. The circle had formed. A frail, immensely wealthy old woman, and the small handful of people who controlled her access to the world, and stood to gain from the fortune she no longer had any other use for. And then Huguette handed them the perfect place to keep her. In early 1991, Huguette Clark, then 84 years old, was finally coaxed out of her Fifth Avenue apartment because she was genuinely, seriously ill. She had let skin cancers on her face go untreated for so long, hidden away and refusing doctors, that by the time she was brought to the hospital, she was severely disfigured and badly malnourished. She was, at that point, truly sick. The hospital may well have saved her life. She recovered. The doctors treated her, and over the following months she healed. And then came the moment that defines this entire story. She was well enough to go home. The medical staff said so. She had 3 magnificent homes waiting, fully staffed, immaculate, ready for her return at a word. And Huguette Clark looked at the choice in front of her, the great empty mansions on one side, and a small, plain, anonymous hospital room on the other, and she chose the hospital room. She simply declined to leave, and she would stay by her own free choice in hospital rooms for the next 20 years until her death at 104. Try to grasp how extraordinary this decision was. People dream their entire lives of a single beautiful home. Huguette had 3 of the finest in America, and she abandoned all of them to live in a hospital. Why? Because the hospital gave her, at last, the thing she had been building toward since Andre died. Total safety, total control. A small, manageable room with no memories in it, no echoing empty galleries, no past. Constant company that asked nothing of her heart. Nurses, paid and present, who could not leave her the way the living always eventually did. The hospital was the FIFA perfect version of the empty mansion, a place to exist without ever having to live, and therefore without ever having to lose. And so the richest recluse in America settled into a routine that would last 2 decades. A plain room. Her dolls and dollhouses brought in and arranged around her. Cartoons on the television, the blinds often drawn. Her nurse at her side. The view of Central Park she could have had from her own palace traded for a hospital wall, and she preferred it that way. So who, in the end, kept Huguette Clark in that hospital room for 20 years? It is tempting to point at the people around her. And we will examine them honestly, because there are hard questions there. But the deepest truth is harder than any villain. Huguette kept herself there. The walls were of her own building, brick by brick, grief by grief, decade by decade, beginning the day her sister died, and she decided never to let the world hurt her again. The hospital didn't trap her. It freed her from the one thing she had feared her whole life, which was other people. This is the turning point, and it is the strangest in your entire collection of dynasties. An heiress who used the greatest gift of her fortune, the ability to live anywhere on earth, to choose the smallest, plainest room available for the rest of her life. But she was not the only one who benefited from that choice, because around that hospital bed, with its $500 million occupant, a quiet and very profitable arrangement was taking shape. For 20 years, Huguette Clark lay in a hospital bed she did not medically need, and the people and the institution around her did extraordinarily well out of her staying there. Start with the nurse. Over the 2 decades Hadassah Perry cared for her, Huguette gave her nurse gifts of staggering size. By the accounting that later emerged in court, the total ran to more than $30 million. Cash, multiple houses, luxury cars, and more. Huguette bought Perry and her family homes. She funded their lives. The private nurse, who had started as an hourly employee, became, through her patients' gratitude, one of the most richly rewarded caregivers imaginable. Now hold the 2 readings of that side by side, because the honest story refuses to be simple. On one reading, this is love, a desperately lonely woman, finally given genuine daily devotion at the end of her life, responding the only way her family ever knew how, with money lavished on the one person who stayed. On the other reading, it is something darker, a fortune flowing, unchecked, toward the single person with the most access and the most influence over an isolated, elderly woman with no one else to advise her. The unbearable truth is that it can be both at once. Real tenderness and real exploitation, impossible to fully separate. That ambiguity is the tragedy. And the nurse was not the only one with an interest in the arrangement. The hospital itself, Beth Israel, came to understand exactly what it had. A billionaire patient occupying a room she didn't need, with no family pushing to take her home. And it pursued her donations aggressively. Over the years, the hospital solicited Huguette for major gifts and received millions from her. Internal communications that later surfaced showed staff discussing her wealth and how to secure more of it. An institution that exists to discharge healthy patients had, in this one case, a powerful financial reason to keep its wealthiest resident comfortable, content, and exactly where she was. Picture the full scene now. A frail old woman, well into her 90s and then past 100, in a plain room with her dolls and her cartoons, and arranged around her, an ecosystem that her fortune had quietly organized. A nurse receiving millions, a hospital courting donations, attorneys and an accountant managing the money and her affairs. Everyone in the room had a reason to keep Huguette right where she was. The most isolated woman in America was, at the very end, surrounded by people whose devotion was inseparable from her checkbook. Look at the 2 ledgers of her life side by side. On one, 3 immaculate empty palaces, priceless paintings, a copper fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars. On the other, a hospital room, a collection of dolls, and a small circle of paid attendants. The greatest gift her fortune could have given her. Freedom, the whole world to live in. She had refused. The only thing it could buy her at the end was company that came with an invoice. And understand the engine running underneath all of it, because it is the whole point of her story. Huguette never used her money to connect, because connection had killed her once already, at 12. So she used it the opposite way, to insulate, to control, to keep the world at a safe and manageable distance. And the bitter result was that the only relationships she had left at the end were, by her own design, transactional. She had spent 80 years making sure no one could get close enough to break her heart. And she succeeded so completely that, at the end, the people closest to her were the ones being paid to be there. She died on May 24, 2011, in the hospital, 2 weeks short of her 105th birthday. She had lived in that room for roughly 20 years. She had outlived everyone she ever loved by the better part of a century. $300 million, 3 palaces, 104 years of life. And in the end, what did it all buy her? A plain room she chose over every palace, and a circle of people whose love she could never quite be sure of. That was the inheritance. At the very beginning, I told you that William Andrews Clark lived by a single secret conviction, and that he would take it to a notorious conclusion. It is time to name it fully, and to weigh what it cost his daughter. He believed that everything has a price, and that with enough money, anything can be bought. He proved it with his own life. He bought mines, banks, railroads, a city, a palace, and, most infamously, a seat in the United States Senate, with cash in envelopes, in open defiance of the contempt of the entire nation. To W.A. Clark there was no good, no honor, no position, and no person that could not, in the end, be purchased at the right price. That was the seed. That was the darkest secret of the House of Clark. Not merely the bribery, scandalous as it was, but the belief underneath it. That money is the master key to every door in human life. He passed that belief to his daughter as surely as he passed her the fortune. And Huguette believed it completely. She simply turned it the opposite direction. Where her father used money to buy his way into the world, into power and prestige and the company of the mighty, Huguette used the identical belief to buy her way out of it. Out of society, out of intimacy, out of risk, out of the reach of grief. Both father and daughter were certain money could buy anything they truly wanted. He wanted the world. She wanted to escape it. The fortune granted both wishes. And here is the terrible irony that closes the loop. They were both right that money could buy what they wanted, and both destroyed by getting it. The father bought his way to the top and earned the open disgust of his age. Mark Twain's verdict outlived all his millions. The daughter bought her way into perfect safety and ended in a hospital room, loved, as far as she could ever tell, by people on her payroll. The family's master belief worked exactly as advertised. That was the curse. Money really could buy them anything, except the ability to want the right things. What is the use of a key that opens every door if the door you finally choose to walk through is the one that locks you away from every other human being for the last 20 years of your life? Huguette Clark was gone at 104. The bloodline ended with her. There was no son, no daughter, no grandchild to inherit the wound along with the wealth. But there was the fortune. $300 million and more, sitting in estates with no obvious heir, and the moment she died, the people who had circled that hospital bed, and dozens of relatives who had never even met her, went to war over it. When Huguette Clark died in May 2011, she left behind something almost no other figure in this entire collection of dynasties left behind. No one. No husband. She had divorced him 80 years earlier. No children. She'd had none. No siblings. André had been dead for 92 years. No close friends. She had spent a lifetime ensuring she had none. The bloodline of William Andrews Clark, the great Copper King, simply ended, quietly, in a hospital room. There was no last heir to carry the name forward. There was only a fortune of more than $300 million and a sudden, swarming vacuum where a family should have been, and into that vacuum rushed the claimants. On one side, roughly 20 distant relatives. Grandnieces, grandnephews, descendants of W.A. Clark's children from his first marriage, people related to Huguette by half-blood and great distance. Most of them had never met her. Many had never spoken to her. Some had reportedly never been allowed past the wall of advisors and nurses she'd built. And now they came forward as her blood to claim her estate. On the other side stood the people who had actually been in the room. The nurse, the hospital, the attorney, the accountant, and 2 competing wills. Here is the bitter symmetry of it. The woman who spent 90 years making sure no one could get close to her died surrounded, at last, by people desperate to be close to her money. In death, Huguette Clark finally got the crowd she had refused her whole life, fighting over her corpse's fortune. The fight came down to 2 documents, signed just 6 weeks apart in 2005, when Huguette was 98 years old. The first will, signed in March 2005, left the bulk of her fortune to her distant relatives, the conventional outcome, blood to blood. But the second will, signed in April 2005, just weeks later, did something radically different. It explicitly cut out the relatives, stating she had little contact with them and wanted them to receive nothing, and instead directed her fortune to others, a large bequest to her nurse, Hadassah Perry, gifts to her doctor, her attorney, her accountant, and the hospital. The conversion of her Santa Barbara estate, Belo Guardo, into a foundation for the arts and a substantial gift to her goddaughter. And there it was, the question that the whole 20 years in that hospital room had been quietly building toward. Was that second will the free choice of a clear-minded woman who genuinely preferred the people who had cared for her to relatives she'd never met? Or was it the product of exactly what the relatives now alleged, an isolated, frail, dependent old woman, cut off from any independent counsel, steered by the very people who stood to inherit? The litigation that followed was enormous and brutal. The relatives challenged the second will, alleging fraud and undue influence. Investigators examined the gifts, the access, the management of her money. And questions were raised, seriously, about whether her attorney and accountant had properly served her interests over the decades. The accountant, it emerged, had a criminal history. The handling of her affairs came under hard scrutiny. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office even looked into the management of her estate. And notice what the fight was really about. Not one of these parties was arguing about who loved Huguette Clark. They were arguing about who had the better legal claim to what she left behind. The most human question. Did anyone in that room care for the woman herself and not the fortune? Was the one question a courtroom is incapable of answering. It hung over the whole proceeding, unanswerable, exactly as it had hung over her entire life. In 2013, after Huguette had been dead for 2 years, the case settled before it could reach a jury verdict. The settlement essentially voided the second will. The distant relatives, the people Huguette had explicitly written out, were awarded roughly $34 million. The nurse, Hadassah Perry, received nothing further and was required to keep what she'd been given in life but forfeit her bequest. She would later face her own reckoning over the tens of millions in gifts. The attorney and accountant were removed and received nothing under the will. And the heart of the estate, including Belo Guardo, the Santa Barbara mansion she'd not seen since the 1950s, went to create the Belo Guardo Foundation dedicated to the arts, exactly as Huguette had wished. Step back and see what the fortune did at the very end, because it is the perfect final act of this story. The relatives Huguette didn't want got millions. The caregiver she did want lost her bequest. The advisors were stripped out, and the money scattered, to lawyers, to a settlement, to a foundation. The one thing the fortune absolutely could not do, even in death, was honor the actual wishes of the woman who'd spent a lifetime guarding it. Her own final document was overturned. Even her last decision was taken out of her hands. And the empty mansions? They were sold or transformed. The 121-room palace her father built had been demolished decades before. The Fifth Avenue apartment was sold. The Connecticut chateau she never slept in was put on the market. The great Clark fortune, built from Montana copper, dispersed into the world, into a foundation, into the hands of strangers, into legal fees. 3 generations of one of America's greatest fortunes, ending not with an heir, but with an auction. Huguette had outlived everyone. And in the end, she could not even keep the one thing she'd hidden behind her entire far life. Lay the whole dynasty out, end to end, and look at what one man's conviction finally produced. William Andrews Clark, the founder, clawed out of Pennsylvania poverty and built a copper empire on a single belief, that everything and everyone has a price. He proved it so completely that he bought a seat in the United States Senate and earned the open contempt of Mark Twain and the entire nation, and he died at 86, certain he'd been right. Andre, the elder daughter, the bright second-generation heiress, died of meningitis at 16, and the fortune that could buy a Senate seat could not buy her a single extra day. Anna, the mother, answered her grief the only way the family knew. She built a monument, a bird refuge bearing her dead daughter's name, and turned loss into something she could own. And Huguette, who inherited the fortune and the belief and the wound all at once, spent 90 years using the greatest fortune in America to wall herself off from every living person, kept 3 palaces empty, loved dolls because dolls cannot die, and chose to spend her last 20 years hiding in a hospital room, surrounded at the end by people whose devotion she could never untangle from her own checkbook. She died at 104, the last of her line, and her final wishes were overturned in court. One cause sits beneath all of it. Not eccentricity, not madness. Every doctor who examined her found her lucid. The deepest cause was a belief, the founder's conviction that money is the master key to everything a human being could want. Huguette believed it as completely as he did. She simply used it to buy the opposite of what he bought. He bought his way into the world. She bought her way out, and the fortune granted both wishes, and ruined both lives in the granting. How does one of the greatest fortunes in America end with a healthy woman hiding in a hospital bed for 20 years and her last wish struck down by strangers? The same way these stories always end, when a family comes to believe the money is the answer to every human need and then discovers, too late and too completely, the one need it was never able to touch. Be careful with the lesson, because it would be easy to take the wrong one. The lesson is not that Huguette was simply a madwoman, or that wealth is a curse cast by fate. By every account, Huguette Clark was gentle, intelligent, generous, and genuinely kind. A real artist, a careful mind, a woman who hurt no one. That is what makes it tragic, rather than merely strange. The villain was never the fortune. The villain was the belief, her father's certainty that money could solve any human problem. Faced with the deepest human problem of all, the terror of loving and losing, Huguette reached for the family's only tool. She used money to make herself untouchable, and it worked. She was never hurt again the way André's death had hurt her, because she never again let anyone close enough to do it. She bought perfect safety. The price was a life barely lived. Now think back to that porcelain doll from the very beginning, dressed and perfect, sitting in a quiet room. That doll is the whole story in a single object. It was never just a collectible. It was the safest possible love. A thing Huguette could care for completely, with all the tenderness she had, and that could never grow up, never leave, never fall ill, never die on her the way her sister did. She filled a hospital room with them, and a hospital room with herself, because dolls and drawn blinds were the only relationships her grief would allow. She had a fortune that could buy any company on earth. She chose the company that could never break her heart. And this is where the Clark family stops being a story and becomes a mirror, because the bargain Huguette made, safety in exchange for connection, walls in exchange for risk, is one almost all of us attempted, in smaller ways, to make. Huguette Clark is the proof of where it ends. There is a poor boy somewhere at the start of this story, weighing gold dust on a scale in the mountains of Montana, and deciding, with total certainty, that money was the measure of all things, and that with enough of it, there was no door in the world he could not open. He was right. He opened every door. He bought the mines, the railroads, the palace, even a seat in the Senate. And he handed that same belief and that same fortune to a daughter who used it to do the one thing he never imagined a person would want. She bought every door, too, and then closed them, one by one. The marriage, the mansions, the world. Until the only room left was a small plain hospital room with the blinds drawn, where the richest recluse in America spent 20 years keeping the whole world safely on the other side of the glass. She had 3 palaces. She chose a hospital bed. She could have had anyone. She chose a doll. For 90 years she succeeded, completely, at the thing she set out to do. She made sure that nothing she loved could ever be taken from her again. She did it by making sure she loved almost nothing at all.